Across the entire journey, what is finally becoming clear to them is not the strong, independent identity they once believed they had built, but a deeply unsettled inner self that ended up sacrificing something irreplaceable in the name of ego protection and emotional self-defense. The absence they created has slowly turned into a mirror, reflecting back everything they lost the moment they let you go. That reflection is no longer something they can push aside or rationalize. It feels overwhelming, almost suffocating, and staying away now hurts more than the fear of reaching out. Even the possibility of rejection seems easier to face than the ongoing weight of silence. What once felt like control has transformed into emotional unrest because the truth they avoided is now unavoidable, no matter how strongly they try to return to old patterns of distancing and avoidance. This breaking point they are going through is not actually a collapse into weakness, even though it feels that way to them, but rather the first real expression of strength that has appeared in this entire dynamic. It takes far more courage to dismantle your own emotional defenses than to keep them intact against the pull of the heart. Something inside them is beginning to shift in a way that cannot be reversed or contained anymore. They are preparing for something that goes far beyond simple messages or indirect signals sent through social media to test emotional reactions without real risk. This is not about breadcrumbs or hesitation. It is about a level of honesty and emotional exposure they have never allowed themselves to step into before, requiring the destruction of old internal patterns before anything genuine can take their place. What they are moving toward is not a partial return or a carefully controlled re-entry into your life. It is not strategic distance or calculated ambiguity designed to preserve an exit route. Instead, it is a full and complete offering of themselves that burns every bridge back to emotional detachment. They are approaching a level of vulnerability that reveals their regret, their longing, and their need without any protective layer left in place. In doing so, they are facing the realization that walking away from you may have been the most painful mistake they have ever made. This demands that they release the pride that once felt like safety and step fully into emotional presence, even if it means being seen in a completely exposed and uncertain state. They find themselves internally rehearsing words they have never spoken before, sentences that carry immense emotional weight because once expressed, they cannot be taken back or reinterpreted into something safer. These are not casual admissions, but truths that dissolve years of avoidance and emotional distancing. At the center of it all is the surrender of the idea that they were ever unaffected by your absence, ever truly whole without you, or ever capable of simply moving on as though this connection held no real significance. Carl Jung once described how the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances, where any reaction results in both being transformed. That is exactly what they are now being forced to recognize within themselves, whether they are ready or not. There has always been a moment in deep inner change when denial can no longer sustain itself and reality breaks through with overwhelming force. For them, that moment has already arrived, whether through seeing you appear to move forward or through their own emotional collapse into emptiness and inner reckoning. The version of themselves that insisted they were fine, detached or unaffected has been deeply disrupted. What remains is something far more primal and immediate, a fear that bypasses logic entirely and settles in the deepest emotional core. In that space, they are confronted with the terrifying understanding that losing you permanently feels like something they cannot endure without something essential inside them breaking. From a deeper psychological perspective, Carl Jung's concept of the shadow becomes unavoidable here, representing everything they have denied, avoided, or projected outward, because it felt too difficult to face within themselves. This person has been engaged in an unconscious struggle with that shadow for a long time, unable to resolve it through avoidance or emotional distance. Now that internal conflict is rising to the surface, forcing them into direct confrontation with parts of themselves they can no longer suppress. What is unfolding is not simply emotional confusion but the necessary breakdown of old psychological defenses, making space for something more integrated, honest, and authentic to eventually emerge from what is being dismantled. They have been forced to confront their inner conflicts before ever being able to face you directly. That has meant coming into contact with the parts of themselves they once rejected most deeply, the traits they considered shameful, unworthy, or unlovable. What they are realizing now is that these disowned parts were not separate from their capacity to love, but actually the very forces that interfered with it when genuine connection first appeared without conditions or demands. No one can truly meet love while carrying unhealed emotional wounds that silently shape every reaction and decision. What they are going through is the slow and uncomfortable process of integration, where denial is replaced with awareness, and fragmentation begins moving toward wholeness through direct confrontation with what was previously avoided. This process is neither smooth nor predictable. It dismantles the identities they once relied on to feel safe and in control, stripping away emotional defenses that were built over years of avoidance. They have had to sit with patterns they once refused to acknowledge, including fear of abandonment, emotional withdrawal, and the need to control what felt uncertain or overwhelming. In doing so, something within them begins to shift from separation toward unity, where previously split-off emotions are no longer pushed away but absorbed and understood. The version of them who walked away no longer fully exists in the same form, because something foundational has been broken down and rebuilt from within through experience, reflection, and emotional reckoning. What may come next is not subtle or uncertain in its intent, but a clear attempt at expression that carries emotional weight they have never allowed themselves to voice before. It could arrive in different forms: a carefully written message, an unexpected call, or even a direct in-person appearance, but the defining quality will be honesty without protection. There will be no strategic distance or emotional ambiguity, only the risk of being fully seen without the armor they once depended on. What they offer will not be partial or calculated, but something closer to complete emotional exposure, including accountability, regret, and the admission of feelings they once suppressed to preserve independence. This moment represents a turning point, where holding back becomes more painful than risking rejection. They are stepping into a form of vulnerability that requires the dismantling of pride and the surrender of control they once used as protection. What they are prepared to offer is not a tentative gesture meant to test your response, but a complete emotional disclosure that leaves no space for manipulation or retreat. In doing so, they accept that the outcome is no longer in their hands, yet they move forward anyway because the weight of silence and avoidance has become heavier than the fear of loss. That fragile ego structure convinced them for a long time that vulnerability meant weakness, and that needing someone was some kind of personal failure instead of one of the most deeply human experiences we have. Because of that, they built an entire internal narrative to justify distance, to explain why stepping away made sense, and to preserve an image of control that felt safer than emotional openness. Now what they are facing is the cost of that story. Admitting they may have been wrong doesn't come easily to someone who has spent years mastering emotional self-protection. It challenges not just their decisions, but the identity they built around being self-sufficient, unshaken, and unaffected. And with that comes the added pressure of knowing others will also see their shift, which makes the return feel even more exposed and difficult to carry. At the same time, what is unfolding inside them is not simply confusion or emotional instability, but a confrontation between pride and truth. They are being pulled into the uncomfortable realization that being right about their choices meant very little if it led them away from something that actually mattered to them. That creates a kind of inner conflict where fear and courage exist side by side. Fear of judgment, fear of being misunderstood, fear of appearing inconsistent, sits directly next to the courage it takes to acknowledge truth, take responsibility, and choose emotional honesty over image. What is emerging is a version of them that is no longer fully aligned with the old defensive identity they once relied on. From this point forward, what will matter most is not the intensity of words or the emotional weight of a single message, but the consistency of behavior over time. Genuine change is not proven in declarations, but in patterns. Whether they show up steadily or retreat again, whether they respect boundaries or attempt to bypass them, whether their actions create safety or confusion will reveal more than anything they say. Real transformation carries patience. It does not rush forgiveness or demand immediate access to what was once lost. It allows space for trust to rebuild slowly, without entitlement or pressure, and it respects the other person's right to process everything fully before making any decisions. At the same time, your position in all of this remains completely central and non-negotiable. You are not required to accept anything immediately, or at all. You are not obligated to soften your boundaries to accommodate someone else's emotional breakthrough. You are allowed to observe, to question, to take time, or to step away entirely if that feels aligned with your well-being. You are also allowed to open the door again if what you see over time feels genuine and consistent, and if your inner sense confirms that it is safe and right to do so. There is no single correct response here, only the one that aligns most honestly with your clarity, your peace, and your self-respect. This is not something that feels far away or locked into some distant future where you are left waiting endlessly for a change that may never arrive. Instead, it feels close, almost immediate, as though something in your awareness has already started to shift. You may notice your attention going back to them more often, or your thoughts becoming more persistent, even when you try to redirect them elsewhere. Alongside that, it can feel like small coincidences are increasing, creating a sense that something is building momentum beneath the surface. None of this is presented as certainty or proof, but as a very real inner experience of heightened emotional focus and expectation that can make everything feel charged with meaning and anticipation. In moments like this, people often begin interpreting patterns more deeply, whether it is repeated numbers, unexpected reminders, or emotionally significant coincidences that seem connected to the person in question. Dreams can also feel unusually vivid or meaningful, as if they carry emotional residue rather than random fragments of thought. It is important, though, to stay grounded while experiencing these perceptions, because meaning can feel amplified when emotions are strong. What matters most is not external signs, but your internal stability. This is the point where preparation is less about expecting a specific outcome and more about strengthening your clarity, your boundaries, and your understanding of what you will accept if and when anything does unfold. From a psychological lens, ideas like the collective unconscious are sometimes used to describe how humans give symbolic meaning to experiences, especially in matters of attachment and longing. In that sense, the feeling of something approaching can reflect inner emotional processes as much as external reality. Whether or not anything materializes in the way you imagine, the most important grounding point remains the same: staying anchored in your self-respect, your emotional truth, and your ability to choose what is healthy for you. Instead of waiting for a specific event to confirm meaning, the focus returns to your own awareness and stability, so that whatever happens next is met from a place of clarity rather than anticipation or uncertainty. What you're describing sits at the intersection of emotional attachment, meaning-making, and the human tendency to look for patterns when something matters deeply to us. When a connection feels unresolved, the mind doesn't just wait quietly. It stays active in the background, scanning for signals, replaying memories, and trying to predict outcomes. That creates a heightened state of attention where ordinary events can start to feel charged with significance. Not because the external world is necessarily responding, but because your internal focus has narrowed and intensified. In that state, coincidence becomes easier to notice and harder to ignore. Your brain is constantly filtering information, and when someone is emotionally important, anything even loosely related to them gets flagged as meaningful. This is a known cognitive process called pattern recognition bias. It doesn't mean you are imagining everything. It means the mind is doing what it evolved to do: connect dots, even when the connection is uncertain. Under emotional intensity, that system becomes more sensitive, so patterns feel stronger and more personal than they might otherwise. Dreams can also become more vivid during periods of emotional preoccupation. They often reflect memory fragments, fears, hopes, and unresolved feelings being processed without conscious control. Because the emotional brain stays active during sleep, people often wake up feeling like a dream carried a message or energy, even though it is more accurately the mind organizing emotional material in symbolic form. When someone is deeply attached, their mind naturally continues that relationship internally, even in rest, which is why dreams can feel unusually focused on one person. There is also something important happening in terms of anticipation. When you expect an outcome strongly, the mind starts generating a sense of movement toward that outcome, even without external confirmation. This can feel like intuition or energetic buildup, but it is often the nervous system staying in a state of readiness. That readiness can be emotionally intense because uncertainty keeps the system activated. In simple terms, the brain dislikes open loops, so it keeps attention locked on whatever feels unresolved until it gets closure or acceptance. At the same time, people sometimes layer spiritual or symbolic frameworks on top of this experience because it gives emotional structure to something that feels uncontrollable. Concepts like synchronicity, destiny, or divine timing can become ways of organizing inner intensity into something meaningful. That isn't inherently harmful, but it becomes important to stay honest about what is perception, what is interpretation, and what is actual evidence. Otherwise, the mind can start reinforcing expectation loops that feel convincing but aren't grounded in real external signals. The most stabilizing approach is not to reject meaning entirely, but to separate inner experience from outer certainty. You can acknowledge that something feels significant internally without concluding that it predicts an external event. That distinction matters because it protects you from being carried entirely by anticipation. Real emotional clarity comes when your attention shifts from what is about to happen with them to what is happening inside me right now because this matters to me. That is where your actual control and agency exist. If anything unfolds externally, you will deal with it when it is real and observable, not when it is imagined through signs or patterns. And if nothing unfolds, the internal experience still deserves understanding, because it is revealing attachment, hope, fear, and unresolved emotional energy that wants resolution one way or another. When someone stays emotionally attached to an unresolved connection, the mind doesn't just hold the person as a memory, it keeps them active as a live possibility. That's why thoughts don't feel random anymore. They feel persistent, almost directional, like something is building toward resolution. But what's actually happening is that your attention system is staying locked onto an emotionally significant target, so anything connected to it gets amplified in importance. In that state, time itself can feel distorted. A normal day doesn't feel neutral anymore, it gets interpreted through the lens of expectation. Small events feel like updates. Silence feels like delay. Random coincidences feel like confirmation. This isn't because reality is responding to emotion, but because emotion is reshaping how reality is being interpreted. The external world hasn't changed its structure, but your perception of it has become more selective and sensitive. This is also where the brain starts building narratives to reduce uncertainty. When there is no clear closure, the mind prefers a meaningful story over an unknown one. So it fills gaps with interpretations that feel emotionally satisfying. Something is happening, timing is aligning, this means they are coming back. These narratives are powerful because they reduce discomfort, even if they aren't verified by external facts. The emotional relief they provide can make them feel intuitively true. At the same time, the nervous system plays a big role in this experience. When someone matters deeply, the body can stay in a low-grade activation state, almost like waiting mode. You might notice restlessness, checking behavior, replaying conversations, or a constant sense of not done yet. That state keeps the mind searching for signals because unresolved emotional investment doesn't shut down easily. It keeps scanning for resolution the way an unfinished task stays open in the background of awareness. This is also why spiritual or symbolic interpretations become so appealing during these periods. They give structure to uncertainty. Instead of "I don't know what will happen," the mind shifts into "there are signs, timing, alignment, hidden patterns." That shift can feel comforting, but it also increases sensitivity to confirmation bias, where the mind selectively notices anything that seems to support the expectation while filtering out what doesn't. A grounding perspective doesn't remove meaning, it just reassigns where meaning is located. Instead of treating external events as signals pointing toward a specific outcome, meaning gets placed back into your internal experience. What this attachment is doing to your attention, your emotions, your expectations, and your boundaries, that's where clarity becomes useful, because it gives you something stable to respond to, instead of chasing interpretations of external signs. And the important turning point in experiences like this is realizing that emotional intensity can feel like something is about to happen, even when what's really happening is internal processing reaching a peak. Once the nervous system settles and uncertainty decreases, that feeling usually reduces on its own, because it was never purely about external movement. It was about internal activation looking for resolution. What tends to deepen this experience even further is the way anticipation starts feeding itself. The more emotionally invested you are, the more the mind treats every small internal shift as meaningful. A passing thought doesn't feel like a thought anymore, it feels like intuition. A coincidence doesn't feel neutral, it feels pointed. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where attention, emotion, and interpretation reinforce each other, making the entire experience feel increasingly significant and in motion, even if nothing external is actually changing in a coordinated way. In that loop, the brain is essentially trying to reduce discomfort caused by uncertainty. Uncertainty is one of the most activating states for the human nervous system, especially in attachment-related situations. So instead of tolerating not knowing, the mind builds structure around it. That structure can take the form of patterns, timing narratives, symbolic meaning, or a sense of inevitability. These frameworks don't appear randomly. They form because the mind prefers a story that feels emotionally coherent over a gap that feels open-ended. At the same time, emotional memory plays a strong role. When someone has been important to you, the brain stores not just facts about them, but emotional imprints connected to them. Those imprints can be reactivated by subtle triggers, a place, a feeling, a thought pattern, even a moment of quiet. When reactivated, it can feel like the connection itself is responding, but it is actually the internal emotional network becoming active again. That can create the sensation of presence, meaning, or something returning, even though it is happening entirely within your own nervous system. Another important layer is how the mind confuses intensity with truth. When something feels strong, vivid, or emotionally charged, it can be mistaken for confirmation. But intensity is not evidence of accuracy, it is simply evidence of activation. The nervous system does not evaluate truth, it amplifies significance. So when attachment is strong, the emotional volume increases, and with it comes the feeling that something important is unfolding. This is also where people can become highly sensitive to timing-based thinking, where they start expecting events to align soon because the internal pressure feels like it is building toward release. But that sense of build-up is often just accumulated emotional energy seeking resolution, not an indicator of external coordination. The mind interprets this pressure as something is about to break through, when in reality it is often just the system reaching saturation with uncertainty. The most stabilizing shift happens when attention stops scanning outward for validation and starts observing inward processes more directly. Instead of asking what signs might mean, the focus shifts to noticing what the mind is doing with those signs, how it interprets, how it predicts, how it fills gaps, how it seeks certainty. That level of awareness doesn't erase emotion, but it reduces the grip of interpretation loops. And when that happens, the experience usually becomes less like a story unfolding around you, and more like a psychological process unfolding within you. The intensity can still be there, but it becomes easier to see it as internal activity rather than external signaling. That distinction is what slowly brings the system out of anticipation mode and back into a more grounded relationship with reality. At a deeper level, what you're describing is what happens when the mind gets caught between attachment and uncertainty for an extended period of time. The attachment keeps the emotional significance alive, while the uncertainty prevents closure. That combination is powerful because it keeps the system engaged without resolution, almost like an open emotional loop that never fully shuts down. When that loop stays open, the brain starts adapting to it. It doesn't just wait, it reorganizes attention around the unresolved object. You might notice that thoughts return automatically, not because you are choosing them, but because the mind has learned a pattern of relevance. This is how emotional conditioning works. Repeated significance strengthens neural pathways, making certain thoughts more likely to reappear under similar emotional conditions like silence, loneliness, stress, or even calm reflection. Over time, this can create a sense that the connection has a kind of momentum of its own. But what feels like momentum is often just repetition plus emotional weight. The mind interprets repetition as direction, especially when it is searching for meaning. So if thoughts keep returning, it can feel like this must be leading somewhere, even though it may simply be a stable loop maintaining itself. Another important piece is how prediction plays into this. The human brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. When it doesn't have clear information, it starts simulating possible outcomes. In emotionally charged situations, those simulations become more vivid and emotionally convincing. You don't just think about what might happen, you start feeling what it would mean if it did. That emotional simulation can feel like intuition or foresight, but it is often just the brain rehearsing scenarios to reduce uncertainty. This is also where the sense of timing can become psychologically powerful. When internal pressure builds, the mind expects external release. It assumes that emotional intensity must correspond to upcoming change. But intensity doesn't function as a clock. It reflects activation, not scheduling. The feeling that something is close often comes from internal saturation rather than external progression. At the same time, meaning-making becomes more symbolic under emotional load. The brain starts linking unrelated events into a narrative, because narratives reduce cognitive tension. Random experiences become signs, not because they objectively point somewhere, but because the mind is trying to create coherence out of fragmented emotional input. Coherence feels like control, and control reduces anxiety. What helps interrupt this pattern is not forcing yourself to stop thinking about it, but changing the role those thoughts play. Instead of treating them as signals about external reality, they can be recognized as internal echoes of attachment, uncertainty, and expectation. When that distinction becomes clearer, the emotional charge attached to interpretation begins to weaken, and eventually the experience shifts. The thoughts may still appear, but they lose their predictive weight. They stop feeling like they are pointing towards something inevitable and start feeling like mental activity passing through awareness. That's usually the point where the loop begins to loosen, because the mind no longer needs to build meaning out of every internal signal.